The door of his office felt heavier than anything I'd ever walked through in my life. Not literally. It was just glass and steel like everything else in the Hargrove Capitol building. But my legs had gone to lead somewhere between the 42nd floor elevator and the moment his assistant stepped aside without a word, and I understood that no one had buzzed me in because no one needed to. He'd been expecting me. "Close it behind you," Beckett said, not looking up from the document in his hands. I did. The latch clicked into place like a period at the end of a sentence I hadn't finished writing yet. His office was floor-to-ceiling windows on two sides, the Chicago skyline spread out behind him like something staged for effect, the kind of view that was supposed to make you feel small. It was working. "Sit down, June." The fact that he used my first name should have been a relief. It wasn't. It was the way he said it, quiet, deliberate, like he was placing a chess piece. I sat. He set the document down and finally looked at me. I'd been working at Renata's for almost 8 months, and in that time, I'd gotten used to the way Beckett Hargrove occupied a room, the way conversations quieted when he walked in, the way even the most senior partners arranged themselves around him without quite realizing they were doing it. But I had never been on the receiving end of his full attention, with nothing else in the room to absorb it. "Tell me why you were at Meridian's offices yesterday," he said. "And before you answer, I already know you were there. I'm giving you the chance to tell me yourself." My stomach dropped somewhere around the 41st floor. I had practiced this conversation in the shower that morning, then in the elevator up, then in the 4 minutes I'd spent in the waiting area, pretending to check my phone. None of those versions had started with him already knowing. 3 months earlier, I was just the event coordinator at Renata's, who was one missed paycheck away from having to call her mother in Tucson and ask to move back in. I know how that sounds. 28 years old, a hospitality management degree I'd worked 2 jobs to finish. And I was still calculating whether I could afford both groceries and the copay for my daughter's allergy testing in the same week. Willa was 6. Bright and loud and allergic to what felt like the entire planet. Every time she sneezed wrong, I did the math in my head. Urgent care runs about $150 without insurance, and I had the kind of insurance that technically existed, but practically required divine intervention. I'd taken the job at Renata's because it paid a salary instead of hourly, which meant I could stop explaining to Willa why we ate cereal for dinner on Thursdays. The restaurant was the kind of place where the menus didn't have prices, and the lighting was calibrated to make everyone look slightly more beautiful than they actually were. I'd been good at it. Managing private dining events, coordinating corporate buyouts, handling the kind of clients who expected perfection as a baseline and considered it a personal insult when the floral arrangements didn't match the napkins. Beckett Hargrove had come in for the first time on a Wednesday in January. I hadn't known who he was when his assistant called to book the private dining room for a 12-person dinner. I'd handled the room setup myself because 2 of my staff had called in sick, and I was not about to let a party of 12, for a name I didn't recognize, turn into a disaster on my watch. I was adjusting the centerpiece when they arrived. I heard the room shift before I saw him. That's the only way I can describe it. A subtle recalibration, like air pressure changing before a storm. The men and women filing in moved slightly differently in his proximity, even the ones who clearly outranked most people in any normal room. He walked in last, tall, dark suit, no tie, top button open in a way that read like a deliberate choice rather than an oversight. He had the kind of face that would have been conventionally handsome if it weren't for the quality of his attention. Something too still, too focused, that made handsome feel like the wrong word. He glanced around the room exactly once, the way someone checks a location against a mental blueprint, and his eyes landed on me. "You're the coordinator. June Calloway," I said, because I'd learned early that offering a name was better than just confirming the obvious. "I'll be managing the room for you tonight. If there's anything you need adjusted before your guests are seated." "The table configuration," he said. I asked for the host position at the north end. I'd put it at the east end. The northern arrangement blocked sightlines to the kitchen pass, which I'd always found created a more relaxed atmosphere for business dinners. I'd made a judgment call. "Of course," I said. "Give me 4 minutes." His eyebrow moved a fraction of an inch upward. Later I'd realized that was what surprise looked like on Beckett Hargrove's face. Almost nothing. We moved the table in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. I know because I was counting. He didn't thank me, but before I slipped out to let the dinner proceed, I caught him watching me from across the room, with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not quite curiosity. More like someone who'd expected a particular answer and gotten a different one instead. The party stayed until nearly midnight. The tip they left was larger than my rent. He came back the following Thursday, alone this time, a late reservation for one, and I only found out because Antonio from the front of house stuck his head in my office at 9:30 and said, "That Hargrove guy is in the dining room. He asked if you were here tonight." I told myself it didn't mean anything. Regulars asked about staff members all the time. I went out to check the room anyway. "Miss Calloway," he said when I stopped by his table. "Not June, this time, Mr. Hargrove. Is everything to your satisfaction?" The osso buco. He glanced at the plate in front of him. "You recommended it." I had when his assistant called to confirm the reservation and mentioned he preferred Northern Italian. "Chef Marino does it particularly well this time of year." "It's excellent." A pause. "Sit down." I almost laughed. "I'm working." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. For a few minutes, I should have said no. I'd always been good at professional distance. It was basically a survival skill in hospitality, where everyone wanted to feel like they had a personal connection with the staff, and the staff needed to remember they were managing an experience, not participating in one. But there was something in the way he said it that wasn't quite a request and wasn't quite a command, and I found myself pulling out the chair across from him before I'd consciously decided to. We talked for 40 minutes. About food, at first, the shift in American dining culture, the way expense account restaurants had evolved post-pandemic, my theory about why people who claimed to hate pretension kept seeking it out under different names. He listened in a way that most people didn't, without performing interest, without waiting for his turn to speak. And then he asked me something I hadn't expected. "What were you doing before this?" "Events management at a hotel downtown," I said. "Before that I was in catering coordination." "That's not what I asked." I looked at him. "I went to school for hospitality management. You took a pay cut to come here." I didn't ask how he knew that. I just filed it away, the way you file things that are both impressive and slightly alarming. "The benefits package is better," I said, "and the hours are more predictable." What I didn't say was, I have a 6-year-old, and predictable hours and a decent health plan are not small things when you're doing this alone. He seemed to hear the thing I didn't say anyway. His gaze dropped briefly to my left hand. No ring, hadn't been one for 4 years, and came back up without comment. "You moved the table to the east end last week," he said, "because you'd determined the north position would create friction with the kitchen noise during the early courses." "That's correct." "You were right." He picked up his water glass. "I prefer north because I don't like having my back to the room." "You didn't have enough information to factor that in." "I'll know for next time," I said. He looked at me over the rim of his glass. "Yes," he said. "You will." I told myself, repeatedly, over the following 6 weeks, that nothing was happening. That a man like Beckett Hargrove, whose private equity firm managed something north of $2 billion in assets, according to the article I'd found at 11:30 on a Wednesday night when Wilka was finally asleep, and I had nothing better to do than research, the man who kept showing up at my restaurant didn't develop meaningful attachments to event coordinators at Italian restaurants. That the dinners, which had started as weekly and gradually become twice weekly, were just habit. That the conversations, which had started ranging from professional to personal, in ways I hadn't quite noticed until I was already in the middle of them, were just what happened when 2 people kept being in the same room. Then the gifts started. First it was a bottle of wine, a specific bottle I'd mentioned in passing, a small producer out of Sonoma I'd discovered at a trade event, and never been able to justify buying for myself. It arrived at the restaurant with a note in handwriting that looked like someone who'd learned penmanship before laptops. "For your assessment of the Wednesday dinner, BH." Then a children's book. A first edition of one of Willa's favorites, the one we'd read so many times the paperback I owned had started falling apart at the spine. I hadn't told him about Willa, or I had, once, in passing, Mentioned picking up early because my daughter's after-school program ended at 6, and he'd remembered. Then, and this was where it stopped being something I could file under professional appreciation. Then an envelope arrived at my apartment building. Not the restaurant. My apartment. With a check covering exactly 4 months of Willa's private allergy evaluation at Northwestern Medicine. The comprehensive panel that her pediatrician had recommended, and I'd been slowly working up to telling her we couldn't afford this year. I stared at that check for a long time. I didn't cash it. I also didn't throw it away, which said something about my state of mind that I wasn't entirely comfortable examining. What I did was drive to Renata's on my day off, march up to the bar where I knew the shift manager would have Beckett's office number from a previous coordination call, and call it from the landline. He picked up on the second ring. "You don't have my home address," I said. "You couldn't have sent this to my apartment." "I do," he said. "I apologize. That was a miscalculation on my part. The delivery was supposed to go to the restaurant. That's not." I stopped. "Why does it exist at all?" A brief silence. "Because you mentioned the appointment was cost prohibitive and then changed the subject." "That was a private conversation." "Yes." No apology in his voice, but something else. Attention, careful and complete. It was. I overstepped. I looked at the check in my hand. "You can't do this. Tell me what I can do," he said, "and I'll do that instead." I didn't have an answer for that. I told him I was returning the check, hung up, and then sat in my car in the parking lot for 10 minutes before driving home, where I found Willa reorganizing her bookshelf by color, and felt the particular specific exhaustion of being someone's entire financial safety net. I kept the check in my dresser drawer for 3 weeks before I did anything with it. I told myself I was deciding. I was actually just losing the argument with myself in slow motion. The thing about Beckett Hargrove was that he didn't announce himself. He simply arrived. In your calendar, in your thinking, in the corner of your peripheral vision, until you turned to look directly at him, and found he'd been watching you the whole time. We had our first actual dinner that wasn't at Renata's in March. He'd texted. He'd gotten my cell number from the restaurant reservation system, which I'd addressed with him once, and then apparently stopped addressing, to say he was sending a car at 7, and I'd sat with my phone in my hand for 15 minutes, and then texted back, "I'll need to be home by 10:30. Willa has school tomorrow." He'd texted back a single word. Noted. The restaurant was the kind of place where you felt the quality of the ingredients in the back of your throat. We talked for 3 hours. He told me about his father's company, a mid-size manufacturing firm in Indiana that had folded when he was 14. The year he'd started understanding that the gap between people who had structural advantages and people who were simply working harder than seemed humanly possible was not a meritocracy gap. He told me about his sister, who was an ER physician in Philadelphia, and called him exactly twice a year to tell him she was fine and he was working too hard. He asked me about Willa's father. "He left when she was 2, I said. "Moved to Portland. We have a custody arrangement that he has not once upheld." Beckett's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "He has visitation rights he doesn't exercise. He has a life he apparently prefers." I kept my voice neutral. I'd had 4 years to get neutral about it. "Willa doesn't ask about him much anymore, which is," I stopped. "It's easier and also worse." He was quiet for a moment. "She has a name for him. She calls him Brandon. A beat. Because that's his name, and she's known since she was 4 that he's not really her dad in the way that counts." Something moved through Beckett's expression that was gone, before I could name it. He refilled my wine without asking. The car had me home at 10:22. By April, I'd stopped pretending I wasn't waiting for his texts. By May, Willa had started asking who I kept smiling at my phone for, and I'd said a friend from work, which was technically in the neighborhood of the truth. By June, he'd met her. Not formally. Not in the way you introduce someone, when you know what you're introducing them as. I'd had a work conflict that pushed my pickup time past Willa's after-school window, and Beckett had. Without asking, which was a pattern of his, I'd learned to have complicated feelings about. Arranged for his driver to collect her and bring her to the restaurant. She'd been sitting at a corner booth eating a fruit cup when I arrived, talking to Beckett about whether sharks could be friendly if they tried. "Most predators," he told her, with complete seriousness, "are only dangerous when they're hungry or scared." Willa had considered this. That's kind of like people, she said. He'd looked up at me over her head, and there was something in his expression, open in a way I almost never saw from him, that did something unfortunate to the part of me that had been running the responsible adult calculation for 4 years straight. I should have said something about boundaries, about not making arrangements involving my daughter, without asking me first. I started to, twice, and both times I looked at Willa chattering happily with this man who was listening to her. With the same quality of attention, he turned on everyone who mattered to him, and I swallowed it. We were in over our heads. I just hadn't admitted it out loud yet. He found out in July. I hadn't done anything wrong. I want to be clear about that, looking back. What I'd done was talk to a journalist, a business reporter from the Tribune, who'd approached me at a charity event I was coordinating, and who said she was doing a piece on the cultural shift in Chicago's private equity sector. And would I be willing to speak on background about Hargrove Capital's client entertainment practices? I'd said very little. I'd said almost nothing. What I'd said amounted to. The firm spent generously on relationship building. The caliber of their events had increased significantly over the past year, and their leadership paid unusual attention to detail. I hadn't thought it would matter. I hadn't realized that Hargrove Capital was in the middle of a sensitive acquisition negotiation that had been kept carefully out of the press, or that any media attention to the firm right now, even flattering, oblique attention, was a problem. I found out about the negotiation the same way I found out he knew about the interview. When his assistant called me at 8:45 on a Tuesday morning and said, in the tone of someone delivering a weather forecast, "Mr. Hargrove would like to see you at 2. Tell me why you were at Meridian's offices yesterday," he said, "and before you answer, I already know you were there. I'm giving you the chance to tell me yourself." I made myself hold his gaze. I wasn't at Meridian's offices. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger, exactly. Something colder. "I was at the Tribune building," I said. "The charity event I coordinated last week. The journalist approached me there. Not yesterday. 3 weeks ago." He was still. "I talked to her for maybe 10 minutes, I said. "On background. I didn't share anything about your clients, your financials, your deals. I spoke in generalities about the restaurant's experience, working with corporate clients. You didn't mention my name. I mentioned the firm once, as an example of a client with high event standards." I kept my voice level. I didn't think it would create problems. I didn't know about the Meridian situation. The silence stretched long enough that I became aware of the ambient sound of the building, the low hum of the HVAC, the distant tick of something mechanical. "The journalist's name," he said finally. "I'm not giving you that." His eyes narrowed. "She approached me in a professional context, and I spoke to her honestly," I said. "What I said wasn't harmful. If it did cause a problem, that's my responsibility to own, and I'm owning it right now. Sitting in your office telling you directly. But I'm not handing over a reporter's name so you can." I stopped, chose my words, apply pressure. The silence this time felt different. Less like a wall and more like a room I hadn't been in before. "You think I'd retaliate against a journalist," he said. "I think you're a man who controls a lot of outcomes," I said. "I think you're used to that. And I think if you're asking me to choose between you and doing something I'd be ashamed of, I'll choose being able to look at myself in the mirror." Beckett stood, and my chest tightened. He walked to the window, stood with his back to me for long enough that I started constructing my exit in my head. Professional, dignified. No crying until I was in the elevator. "The Meridian deal," he said to the glass, "is worth $460 million. It's been 18 months in the making. If it falls through because of a news cycle." He stopped. "I'm sorry," I said. "I genuinely didn't know. I know you didn't." He turned around. Something in his face had shifted, not softer exactly, but open in a way that felt like it cost him something. "That's why you're here instead of receiving a very polite letter from my legal team." I felt the breath go out of me in a way I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "There's a family practice," he said, and the pivot was so unexpected I didn't follow it for a moment. "My corporate legal team uses it for sensitive matters. I want you to consider." He stopped again, recalibrated. "I want to ask if you'd be willing to come in and speak with them, not to suppress anything, to understand what's protected and what isn't, so you can make informed decisions in the future." I stared at him. "You're offering me a lawyer. I'm asking if you'd like one. A pause. There's a difference. I thought about all the things I'd expected this meeting to be. None of them had included this. Beckett, I said. His name, not his last name. I'd made the switch somewhere around February without quite deciding to. He waited. Why does it matter to you? I asked. Whether I'm protected, whether I understand my rights. What is this actually about? He looked at me for a long moment. You know what it's about. I'd like to hear you say it. Another silence. Then, because you matter to me, you and Willa both. He said it the way someone states a fact they've been waiting a while to state. No performance in it. And that means your exposure is my concern, regardless of whether what's between us is defined. I thought about all the ways I'd been cataloging the last 6 months. The wine, the book, the medical check, Willa and the shark conversation, the quiet gravity of him in every room he entered, the way I'd started sleeping better, which I hadn't noticed until I mentioned it to my friend Patty, and she said, June, that means something, and I'd said, it means I'm less stressed about the copay, and we'd both known that wasn't the whole answer. I have a daughter, I said. She's going to want to know who you are and what you mean, and I can't give her an answer to that until I know it myself. Then let me give you one, he said. He did, over the following weeks, in the way Beckett did most, not with grand declarations, but with accumulated evidence. The legal consultation he'd mentioned turned out to be a senior partner who spent an hour walking me through media engagement and personal information rights, asking nothing in return. He started texting Willa directly, with her permission, always something small. A photo of an architectural detail he'd passed that she would find interesting, a recommendation for a graphic novel series he'd read a review of and thought she'd like. The first time she texted him back without prompting me, I stood in the kitchen doorway and felt something shift in my chest. He told me, in October, about the deal that had defined his early career, a leveraged buyout that had gone catastrophically wrong, wiped out 18 months of work, and nearly cost him the firm. He'd rebuilt it, slower, more carefully, with a fundamentally different philosophy about what constituted acceptable risk. He told me about the years he hadn't told anyone about that period, the specific loneliness of a public failure, when you'd been raised to understand that failure was private. You don't talk about it, I said. We were sitting on the couch in his apartment. I'd been there a handful of times now, always aware that it was a significant room, that being in someone's home was different from being in their public space. I don't, he agreed. Why tell me? He looked at me. Because you asked me, 6 weeks ago, what I was actually about. He reached for my hand, turned it over. This is part of the answer. I looked at our hands, his larger, with the faint evidence of a scar along one knuckle that I'd never asked about. What's the rest of it? I'm getting there, he said, and for the first time since I'd known him, something in his voice was almost uncertain. Willa met him properly in November. Not the chance encounter at the restaurant. A deliberate Sunday afternoon, my kitchen, Beckett, making the only thing he admitted to being able to cook reliably, which was scrambled eggs with goat cheese, while Willa conducted what could only be described as an interview. Do you have pets? She asked, sitting on the counter with the ease of someone who'd claimed that territory as hers approximately 4 years ago. No, he said, without looking up from the pan. Willa wants a dog, I said. Mom says maybe when we have a yard. Willa watched him stir. Do you have a yard? I have a building, he said. It has a rooftop garden. Willa weighed this. Could a dog live on a roof garden? Some dogs, he said. Small ones. Patient ones. Willa had very serious opinions about which dog breeds had the requisite patience for rooftop habitation. She communicated these opinions for approximately 25 minutes. Beckett listened to all of them. When she'd gone to watch something on her tablet after lunch, I stood at the sink and felt him come up behind me, his hands settling on my shoulders. She's remarkable, he said quietly. I know. I turned around. She's the best thing I've ever done. Yes. He looked at me the way he sometimes did, like I was a problem he'd already solved, and was now just quietly appreciating. I agree. I thought about saying all the things I'd been compiling, the reservations, the questions, the ways this was complicated and unconventional, and nothing like the life I'd planned when I was 22, and still thought plans were predictive. I thought about saying, this is a lot, and I'm scared, and I've been on my own for a long time, and I'm not sure I remember how to trust this. Instead, I said, stay for dinner. He stayed. The year turned quietly. Willa started second grade. The Meridian deal closed, eventually, without incident. I found a job coordinating events for a nonprofit arts foundation. Better mission, better hours. A salary that didn't require weekly math on groceries versus copays. Beckett had not suggested the job. He'd mentioned once that a colleague's organization was looking for someone with my specific experience, and I'd applied without telling him. And I'd gotten it on my own, and when I told him, he'd looked at me in a way that I was now able to name without difficulty as pride. We'd figured out a rhythm. He was still private, still controlled, still the kind of person who moved through a room like he'd already mapped all the exits. But in the specific geography of our life together, dinner twice a week, Sunday mornings with Willa, long calls on Thursday nights when one of us was traveling, he'd learned to hand me a version of himself that he didn't put on for anyone else. One Wednesday evening in January, almost exactly a year after I'd first adjusted his table configuration, we were sitting in his apartment after Willa had fallen asleep on the couch, mid-movie, and he'd carried her to the guest room without discussion, the way people do things they've decided without formally deciding. He came back and sat down next to me, didn't turn the television back on. "I need to tell you something," he said. I waited. "I had someone look into your situation with Brandon Keyes." He said Willa's father's name carefully, watching my face. When you told me about the custody arrangement in March, I asked for a background review. I should have been angry. I recognized, abstractly, that the response this was supposed to produce was anger. "What did you find?" I asked. "That he's had 2 DUIs in Oregon since 2021. That he's currently $2,000 behind on the support order. That he's been contacted by a family law firm twice in the past year, by parties attempting to modify the custody arrangement, and has not responded to either contact." I looked at my hands. "He's not going to contest anything." "No." A pause. "But you have grounds to move for modification regardless, to formalize something that's already functionally true." He reached over and took my hand. "If you wanted to. You should have told me you were doing that," I said. "Yes, no deflection, no justification. I should have, I'm sorry." I looked at him. This careful, controlled man, who'd spent a year building something with me and Willa in the only way he knew how. Obliquely, structurally, through accumulated evidence instead of grand announcements. Who'd never once said "I love you" in those exact words, but had said it 17 different ways in the past 12 months. "Beckett," I said. "I know," he said. "I know this wasn't my call." "No," I agreed, "but it's also." I tried again. "The reason you did it. That matters." He looked at me with an expression I'd stopped trying to decode and started just receiving. "You know the reason. Tell me anyway." He picked up my hand and held it in both of his, the way he sometimes did, like he was taking inventory of it. "Because you shouldn't have to carry all of it alone anymore. Either of you." He paused. "And because I intend to be here long enough that it matters what her legal situation looks like." The room was quiet for a moment. The city lights made the windows glow. "Willa called you by your first name today," I said. "Not Beckett, just Beck." Something changed in his face. Barely anything. Everything. "I noticed," he said. "She doesn't do that," I told him, "with anyone." He looked at me for a long moment, then he said quietly, "I want to marry you. I don't need an answer tonight. I just want you to know that's where this is going, from my side. When you're ready. If you're ready." I thought about the version of myself from 14 months ago, tired down to her bones, calculating medical copays in the grocery store, absolutely certain that the best she could do was hold it together for Willa, and hope that was enough. I thought about the version of Willa who no longer looked sad when her friends talked about their dads. "Ask me again on a Sunday," I said. "When Will's awake." He held very still. "Why?" "Because," I said, "she should be part of the answer." He pulled me toward him, his arm coming around my shoulders with the quiet weight of something that had stopped needing permission. We stayed like that. For a long time, the city spread out beyond the windows, and I let myself feel the specific recklessness of believing that something this unexpected could hold. He asked on a Sunday in March, in my kitchen, while Willa was eating toast and Beckett was making the eggs she'd declared her definitive favorite. He'd taken a small box out of his jacket pocket and set it on the counter next to the salt shaker, as casually as someone setting down car keys, and Willa had seen it first. "What's that?" she asked, mid-bite. "That," Beckett said. turning off the burner, is something I'd like you both to weigh in on. She'd climbed down from her stool and opened it herself, because Willa had never once in her life waited when she could act instead, and looked at the ring for a long moment with the expression of someone conducting serious analysis. "It's blue," she said. "Your mother's favorite color," he said. Willa looked at me. "Are you going to say yes?" I looked at Beckett, who was watching me with something behind his eyes that I didn't have a word for and didn't need one. "I think so," I said. "What do you think?" She considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who understood the weight of things. "I think," she said finally, "that Beck makes you less tired." Beckett made a sound I'd never heard from him before, brief and unguarded, almost a laugh but not quite, the sound of something loosening. I said yes. It wasn't the path I'd planned, or even the path I'd have chosen if someone had offered me options. It was the one I'd walked into with my eyes open, one careful, accumulating step at a time, and standing in my kitchen with Willa pressing the ring box into my hands, and Beckett looking at me like I was the answer to a question he'd stopped expecting to get right. I understood for the first time without any reservation that some things aren't built from perfect circumstances. They're built from showing up, again and again, until the structure holds.